There's no standard of care for people like me. There are no guidelines or anything written for even things as simple as handling regret or stopping hormone usage. As it is, like, there just is no acknowledgement of detransition or the people who go through it in the medical system when we're pumping millions of people through it. It's unacceptable.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Chloe Cole. Subscribe here, wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now, this story we're going to talk about didn't get much attention, but in early January, a federal judge in Kentucky ruled against the Biden administration's Title IX rules on gender identity. The decision, as described by the New York Times, said, quote, the education department had overstepped and violated teachers' rights by requiring them to use students' preferred pronouns. That is a huge decision. And this happened as Donald Trump's incoming administration was preparing to make good on the president-elect's day one pledge to cut funds from, quote, any school pushing critical race theory, transgender insanity, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. He directly repeated that pledge, often on the campaign trail. Take a look.
I will immediately sign a new executive order to cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, transgender insanity, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children.
What's especially timely about the judge's decision is that it was the Obama-Biden administration that in 2016 coerced schools to legally conflate sex and gender identity in their interpretation of Title IX. It was written, Title IX, of course, originally to prevent, quote, sex discrimination. This was like a shot in the arm for the LGBT movement at the time, which had just won the Obergefell case on same-sex marriage 1 year earlier, and felt it really had the wind at its back when it came to normalizing far-left concepts of gender identity. Bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports teams were all on the table, and the fight became a horrifying political football, thanks to that decision to leverage federal funds in that way from the DC bureaucracy. So after some frequently forgotten hesitation, Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, eventually signed off on rolling that conflation back. The Biden administration, predictably, then rolled back the rollback. While Kamala Harris tried to avoid the issue, the Trump campaign's now famous Kamala is for they, them ad was found by even Kamala Harris's top super PAC to be among the most effective of the cycle, according to the New York Times, reportedly, quote, shifting the race 2.7 percentage points in Mr. Trump's favor after viewers watched it. So as Trump's team prepares to reclaim the bureaucracy with this cultural vibe shift afoot, the Daily Wire is out with a new documentary called Identity Crisis. Here's a part of the trailer.
I've often said that gender-affirming care is health care, it is mental health care, and it can actually be suicide prevention care.
I think I'm gonna take some medicine so I can kind of like transform into a boy, get surgery.
After the surgery, I didn't really feel any better.
When it stopped being a thing for adults and it started to be a, let's teach this to kids.
Total lie, manipulation, it's gaslighting.
Please stop. He's a boy, not a girl. How could she do this to my son?
What they're talking about is hormonal therapy or sex reassignment surgery on children.
I thought fixing me externally would fix me internally. But of course I was wrong.
The Daily Wire describes the film in part as one that, quote, shares deeply personal accounts from detransitioners, parents, and professionals fighting against a system that prioritizes political agendas over child welfare. One of those detransitioners is our guest today. Chloe Cole is an activist who shares her personal story all over the world. She was given blockers at the age of 13 and a double mastectomy at the age of 15 before she detransitioned then at the age of 16. She joins us now to share her story and to share her perspective on what's ahead from the incoming administration and also from the detransition movement, which honestly I think has been the thing that has changed so many people's minds, that has changed the quote-unquote vibe in the country when it comes to this issue. So Chloe Cole, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Chloe, I know a lot of people are very familiar with your story, a very powerful story. For anybody who isn't, would you be able to just maybe give us a brief introduction to what you've experienced in your own life as we begin?
So I am an advocate for the rights of children and parents and family. And this comes from some of my own experiences as a child, particularly with the medical industry transitioning me between the ages of 12 to 16 from the identity of a young woman to a young man, both socially and medically. So I was about 12 years old when I started to feel that because of my body image issues, because of some of my struggles with my learning disability and socialization and puberty, that I didn't really feel like I fit in, you know? I didn't really feel like I aligned with really the other women or girls around me. And I thought that was something that took away from me as a person, as a woman. And I started to fall into this belief that I was a transgender young man who happened to be stuck in the body of a young woman. And from 13 years old, the medical process began for me with puberty blockers, using a chemical castration agent called Lupron, and cross-sex hormones. All of this happened before I was even old enough to drive a car, before I could even legally drive a vehicle, right? I underwent a radical double mastectomy to get rid of my breast. And that was when things took a quick turn for me, because it hit me then how drastic this was for my body. And the fact that I had lost my ability to breastfeed and such a major part of my identity as a woman really just hit me then. And there came a lot of sadness with this epiphany, but there also came a lot of hope when I realized that there was nothing about me that I had to change in the first place, that I was a beautiful young woman the way that I was. Perhaps I was more tomboyish, perhaps in some ways I differed from the women around me, but I still was beautiful. And I could still go back to the way that I was made and find happiness in that. And at the age of 16, I detransitioned. And very shortly after that, I started to speak first online and then publicly about some of my own experiences, and advocated for the right of children to growing up with their bodies fully intact, to not being mutilated or being taken away from their parents, or their parents not being swindled by these doctors who do not genuinely at all care about the best interest of the child.
That's where I want to pick up, because in the Daily Wire's new documentary Identity Crisis, you talk about how when you started to question some of the medical treatments you received, doctors refused to give you support, refused to give you guidance, as you say in the film. Can you talk to us a little bit more about your experience with maybe rethinking, reconsidering some of the treatments you were given before you fully detransitioned? What were doctors telling you in that moment?
I didn't talk about my regret or any of the grief that I was going through until after I decided to detransition, at which point my doctors just then shrugged it off like it was nothing. I would go into full discussions with them about the sadness that I was in, how depressed I was. And they would just tell me things like, well, don't you think that's just another transition? Like, what's different about the first time around? Or are you sure that you're maybe not just non-binary? And when it came to like the actual like physiological aspects of detransition and me needing help with getting things like hormone tests scheduled, or even just talking about what the future might look like for me in a medical sense, I really had no real answer. There's no standard of care for people like me. There are no guidelines or anything written for even things as simple as handling regret or stopping hormone usage. As it is, like there just is no acknowledgement of detransition or the people who go through it in the medical system when we're pumping millions of people through it. It's unacceptable.
Did you get the sense your doctors were surprised that you were expressing the desire to detransition?
Some of them, yes. they had no idea what to do with me. And this was after years of me being very persistent and consistent in this identity, and seemingly at first to get better. I I had pretty much everything in the book going for me. I passed as a member of the opposite sex. I looked like pretty much any other boy in his late teens, and I had a deeper voice than most of my male peers, even. And everybody in my life, from my family to my teachers to my peers at school, most of my peers had only ever known me as a young man. So it would have seemed from the outside that this would have been incredibly unlikely for me. And I still came out of it.
And what's it like now? Because that's a really interesting point you raised that I don't know a lot of people have thought about. Obviously, the title of Abigail Schreier's book is famously Irreversible Damage, but in the process of trying to experience reversibility, Chloe, you say nobody knows what to do with a person like me. What does that prognosis look like going forward for you? Are you ready to jumpstart your health in 2025? Meet Lumen, the world's first handheld metabolic coach. Lumen is a small, cutting-edge device that measures your metabolism through your breath. So interesting. Using the Lumen app, you'll learn whether your body is burning fat or carbs at any given moment. But it doesn't stop there. Lumen provides tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. And it's easy. Just breathe in your Lumen each morning to see what your metabolism needs. Then get a daily nutrition plan that is tailored to you. You can also check in before and after meals or workouts for real-time tips to stay on track. Your metabolism is your body's engine, and keeping it healthy means better energy, fitness, sleep, and weight management. Lumen even adjusts to hormonal changes like your cycle or menopause, so you can maintain balance and feel your best. Take control of your health this year. Visit lumen.me/undercurrents for 20% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/undercurrents for 20% off. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode.
I'm really not sure. I don't know what the future of my health is going to look like from this point on. We don't really fully understand how things like blocking puberty or massive sustained doses over years of cross-sex hormones, or especially the surgical interventions, affect the human body over one's lifespan, because it's all just one big experiment. I don't even know the state of my fertility right now, or if I'm going to be able to naturally mother children of my own, what potential side effects might arise for me as the mother or for my children, and if I'm able to carry or conceive. But I think that there's a lot of hope on the horizon. I think that with this new administration, there are going to be a lot of developments legally, legislatively, federally, and potentially with a systematic review on all the available data that we have right now, which I think is so incredibly needed in the US. And I know a lot of other detransitioners. A lot of my friends are also detransitioned, and many of them have been through very similar experiences as me. Some at my age or younger, and they've managed to live happy, normal, healthy lives after the fact. I have probably about 5 or 6 friends who've been able to have healthy children of their own after the fact.
That's amazing. That's amazing to hear. And you mentioned the new administration. It raises to me this question. Louise Perry has written about like the quote unquote respectability cascade, where everybody sort of realizes that what they see publicly or what they thought privately is now being okay to say in public. And so then it just sort of the snowball starts rolling down the hill, and the Trump administration is taking office definitely in the midst of this respectability cascade. Is there anything you worry the right in particular will miss when it comes to having compassion and empathy for kids dealing with dysphoria? Do you have any concerns about that? Or what would you tell people on the right who are now very energetic? They have the momentum behind them and they want to go in and change the world, help kids like you. Is there anything that they should know so that they don't, you think, maybe harm people experiencing dysphoria?
I think that just banning these treatments is not enough. This is not a battle that we can fight halfway. we have to remember that these kids are still going to be dealing with this distress and the lies that they've been told around it after the treatment is taken away. So we have to supplement it with something. We have to be giving them the care that they really need. We have to be helping them psychologically, processing where these feelings come from, so that the suicides, the mental health issues that they are being told will happen if they don't get what they want, if they're not addressed at all, don't happen. And we need to address those of us who have already been hurt by the system. There are, like I said, there are no measures in place. There's no standard of care. There's no insurance coverage for any of the treatments that we are going to need post-transition at all. And it's obviously the children are the most important part of the equation here. The fact that children are being harmed, that their development is being stunted and directly harmed, should be at the forefront. But we also cannot forget the adults. We cannot forget the adults who have been harmed. Because whether you're a child or an adult, these are treatments that harm the body and mind and soul. And we need to help those individuals too.
Can you actually tell me more about the adult aspect of that? Because it's so common. I know you're you're such a critical part of the movement. You probably see this all the time. There are a lot of people, center right, who say it's just about the kids. We got to help the kids. And it makes sense to your point that would be at the forefront. And one of the things you mentioned in the documentary is that we have quite a way to go. What does that mean in terms of as the spotlight maybe shifts from adults? We maybe have this consensus when it comes to kids, but where does that leave the adults? What do you think people in charge should do to help people who are adults who maybe want to detransition?
Right. One of the things that I hear very often working with other people is, like the kids are really important, but when it comes to the adults, once you hit 18, you can just do whatever you want, right? I feel like that's a very callous way to think. We should care about everybody. And obviously, we can't stop every single adult from making a bad decision around their bodies or their lives, but we should be giving them time of day and attention to potentially prevent them from getting hurt too, because they matter just as much.
Actually, I wanted to ask sort of about the earlier part of your story where you're initially getting all of this guidance. You're very young, 13 years old, from doctors telling you X, Y, and Z, you should do this, you should do that. Because I think, Chloe, that's still happening. And it probably happens to people who are adults, who are just looking for something to make them feel better. And medical professionals are telling them this. What's that like?
Right. I mean, many of these adults, even, these are impressionable people who we are dealing with. Many of them are psychologically not well enough, or they otherwise don't have the mental faculties to be able to make these lifelong decisions. And they're being told by doctors who they have trust in that this is the standard of care, that the science is already solved, that it has been solved, and that this is going to make them feel happy, whole, and closer to the supposed true gender identity that they have. They pull out these shoddy statistics and these studies that aren't based in any medicine during these appointments to convince the patient or their families into doing this to themselves.
And I imagine you continue to hear from people to whom this is happening. This is still a concern. There's hospitals around the country are probably still trying to treat patients this way. I imagine you hear that, Chloe. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, yeah, absolutely. This is still going on in the thousands. There's so many children and young men and women who are still being affected by this. And that's not even talking about the parents who are dealing with this, who are in custody battles, who have had their children already ripped away from them by another parent or by the state, and are dealing with court orders that make it so that they can't see their children ever again. I know many parents who are dealing with this.
Well, probably few people have heard as many of these stories as you have, because I'm sure a lot of people who don't share their stories even publicly come to you privately. And I was just so curious to ask Chloe if that's ever emotionally like a lot of baggage for you to go through your daily life with, because I'm sure people are constantly reaching out to tell you their own stories. What's it like just to, I'm sure on the one hand it's healing and cathartic, but on the other hand, it's probably very difficult to carry that weight with you every day.
It can be difficult for sure. Seeing what happened to me, repeating itself over and over again can be incredibly frustrating. So just seeing how much progress we still have to go after years of being in this. But it makes me happy that people can see me as a beacon of hope, as somebody to come through to help them with their own with their own difficulties with this. It makes me feel like I am not so alone in this fight. I think the single greatest thing that really brought me personal healing in this was after I began speaking out publicly online and having a bunch of parents and other detransitioners and other people who have otherwise been involved in this in some way reaching out to me and just sort of building that almost like a sense of family with them. This movement would not have gained such a foothold. It would not have moved as quickly and become as successful as it has without these other people fighting alongside me.
I want to, as we close here, go back to this question of the respectability cascade that I mentioned Louise Perry writing about earlier, because I think it's really interesting. And I'm curious, Chloe, if you see this process happening now as well, where everyone kind of looked around and said, okay, it seems like it's okay to say this now. It's okay for me to say, I think this is wrong. Are you seeing that socially, like maybe among the broader public? And are you seeing that with media? Do you think it's sort of tide has turned there?
Absolutely. I mean, I could kind of get a sense of that shifting at the time just before I started speaking up when I was 17, a little bit in the media. But I hoped that by speaking out, it would help to foster a culture where more people could speak about the truth of the subject a little bit more. And that was exactly what happened as more detransitioners, as more victims, as more parents, and eventually doctors, therapists, whistleblowers came out of the works to really, really talk about this. And the general, I get the sense that I've seen how the general public has really, really followed.
Hmm. Have you heard from people who say, I kind of understand why I was wrong now, I was maybe too afraid, or I just wasn't, the media coverage was so bad? Like when people come up to you or send you messages, is there anything that they like maybe single out as what led them astray? Were they trying to be compassionate and they read it in the New York Times? Like what was it? Maybe you've heard this from people who now say, wow, I was wrong, or I was led in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I've actually had this happen a lot. I've even had like former like transgender activists later come to me, who some people who have even like gone after me incredibly harshly, later talk to me in private and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. You were right about this. And I think that like deserves a lot of respect, that people like that who once were fighting so hard in the other direction are able to come around and admit that they weren't right about it.
You know, identity crisis gives a really powerful voice to people like you. And I guess my last question for you, Chloe, is just where does the detransition movement go from here? What's next? Is it about to keep growing as more and more people realize they want to detransition? Do you feel like it's growing? What's next?
It's absolutely growing. I have been speaking at various venues for a few years now, at different churches, colleges, schools, everywhere that I go. It's like every other place. I meet a new detransitioner just out in the wild, not even knowing that they're there, right? And there's always somebody I meet on like almost a weekly basis. What we're seeing of this movement now is just a fraction of how large it is going to be in the next decade.
Chloe, I'm in the opinion business, so I can say I think you're a hero. Thank you for everything that you do. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much.
Now, the Daily Wire describes that documentary as something that was inspired by the successes of Matt Walsh's documentary at the Daily Wire, What is a Woman? And it's interesting looking back now on that documentary. I was really surprised by the public's reaction to it. Not because, I didn't think that it had an important point, but just because it tested the limits of the left's perspective on this, the far left's perspective on this, which had been baked into the Democratic Party's position on it against what a lot of people really, probably if they had thought it through fully and put a ton of time and effort into thinking through what was about to happen legally around the country when, for example, the bureaucracy changed Title IX from sex to gender identity. I think it took the awful experiment that Chloe says she was a part of to play out for people to realize that those limits desperately needed to be tested. And so, a documentary coming out just as the Trump administration is preparing to do some of this is interesting to me because the vibe shift is real. And back in, this must have been 2017, when Betsy DeVos was the education secretary, the New York Times reported she ultimately made the right decision, but that she was hesitant to actually roll back the gender identity sex conflation that the Obama administration had done because she didn't want to hurt transgender children. Nobody wants to hurt transgender children. It's absolutely true. And if anything was going to hurt transgender children, I think everyone's comfortable saying now it would be continuing to double and triple down on an ideology that leads them so often down these paths, like what Chloe went down. So it was really helpful to have Chloe here to talk a little bit about the detransition movement, about being part of it, about what's going to happen in the future, and just get some personal perspective on what's transpired over the course of the last decade or so, and what could immediately be on the horizon. Hopefully it's better. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for subscribing here on the Undercurrents YouTube channel, for subscribing wherever you download your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. We appreciate it so much, and we'll see you back here with more Undercurrents soon.